Okay. Bruce, you want to take it away? You need to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Yeah, right off the bat. Did you want to do the share screen on the PowerPoint?
Yep, pulling it up right now.
Okay, very good.
All right, it should be there.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, then we're going to talk a little bit about an update on the townhome guidelines and where we stand with that, how it's being incorporated into certain brownfield agreements. And then we're going to go into talk a little bit about an update on our methane guidelines. This has become a topic because we have a number of sites, an increasing number of sites that are going through the process where they are developing on sites that are on or near waste that is generating methane in the ground. And we want to make sure that we are not having issues with that in the future. So these sites have prompted us to move forward with a generalized guideline process, developing that for methane. And Tracy's going to talk a little bit about that. And then we will open it up for questions and answers. I know that we've received a few questions already in advance of the meeting, and we'll start with that, but then have an open question and answer session for folks who are here. All right, so in providing a little bit of a program update here, and we've had some questions on this too, but we have been able to hire 2 new staff, one of whom is Aditi Chakravarti, and she was actually here as a temporary staff person who was our eligibility coordinator, and we are so pleased to be able to hire her on a permanent basis. And so Aditi is now permanently with the program, and we are really thrilled by that. I know that folks have been coordinating with her for some time on eligibilities, and we are very pleased that she's been able to get on with us permanently. And then we also have hired an engineer into the program as a project manager. This is Holly Samaha, and she just started on June 1st, and so she's being onboarded through Microsoft Teams and doing a bang-up job with that. And Sharon is going to be her supervisor, and she's getting up to speed on a number of different projects that are coming her way. And so we are very, very pleased to have her involved in this as well. Additional positions have not yet been posted, and they are still on the horizon. But I think as we have been proceeding with this, some of the issues pertaining to COVID and the economic situation have caused us to at least hold back on doing that for the time being. In the next state fiscal year, we look to be doing even more hiring, though, as we see potential for projects that are continuing to come in. I think that in the processing of agreements and the applications that we have seen, we saw throughout March and April no real decrease in project numbers. I think in May we saw a bit of a dip. In June, I think we are seeing a little bit more than we saw actually in May. So we're just going to keep an eye on those new projects that are coming in. But I think what we're talking about here is an intermediate term thing, not necessarily a long-term dip. I do believe that at some point in time we'll be seeing more projects coming in, and that's probably something that we'll be talking with you all about here in our open forum at the end. So talk a little bit about the soil management guidelines. Last time when we met on March 5th, we had big session on that. I just wanted to give a little bit of an update. We're not going to go too far into that, but I will just say that the beneficial reuse rules, which, as you were heard at the last stakeholder meeting, was a process that was ongoing. That process is still on track, and those rules may come out at the time frame that solid waste has estimated would be the first quarter of 2021. And so we believe those rules are still on track for that time frame. I'll just let you know a couple things also that we're doing. We're not going to go into great detail right now, but we are developing a streamlined BFA shell. And I think I mentioned previously in the March 5th meeting that we would be going over and doing this kind of thing, and trying to get back to a situation where a brownfield agreement contains the things that are necessary under the statute, and we are not getting too bloated in the text and prose that we have in the brownfield agreement. So we're working on that as well. And I think some of these new brownfield agreement shells you'll be seeing as we proceed down the road in negotiating brownfield agreements. We're already seeing those starting to come out in terms of development. So that'll be coming out as we do more and more development on that shell. And then later this year, we will also have likely to be an update to the EMP template. And that is being worked on as well. So I'll just mention that, and I don't have a whole lot of details on that just yet, but that is coming.
Anything else, Bruce?
No, that's it from me.
Okay.
So I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn and talk a little bit about townhomes.
So we talked about townhomes in more detail in March, so I'm not going to go into extreme detail about the checklist. We did finalize the checklist that we had drafted. There's really no modifications. What we opted to do, one of the concerns that we had is kind of the long-term issues with townhomes. And so that financial assurance component is really what we opted to kind of tweak. So I'll show you from our website. Hopefully this will work. If you're not familiar with our statutes and guidance page, this is really where a lot of our program information lives. So I would encourage you to kind of favorite this web page. The issue resolutions this is a summary of a lot of different things. So there's a discussion of townhomes in here, but then also the townhome minimum requirements checklist is posted on our website. Just so you have it and you can access it. From the, let's see. All right. Okay, I think that worked. The 3D in the checklist is really what changed from what we showed you in March. And it defers some of the financial assurance components to a later date. What we were unsure of is what some of those financial components look like and how we do that. But a lot of the technical requirements are something that we wanted to stick with and to have for you all in your planning process. So this is really the biggest change. It essentially says we're going to evaluate it and negotiate as part of the brownfields agreement, and we may review some additional financial assurance components in the future, but we just weren't at a place that we didn't want to hold up the checklist any longer because of that we didn't want to go from there. So we had a couple of questions related to townhomes, so we may as well just pick those up real quick because I think the next slide is methane. So we can finish up our townhome discussion first. Generally speaking, the question is that if there's been sufficient soil gas sampling that shows no soil gas of concern, does that remove the need for special townhome language and exhibit? And the answer, generally speaking, is no. If it's a townhome, it's the individual ownership that is a concern for us, and enforcing against individual owners for a variety of things. And that townhome language does really authorize the HOA. It requires the HOA to have the authority and the ability to enforce and to take care of the brownfields issues for the property as a whole. So it really is important to us to have that, even if soil gas is not a concern. And the minimum requirements generally also include a vapor barrier and some vapor mitigation strategy for townhomes. There are very minimal exclusions for that, and it would be something if you're in a rural area where there's really absolutely nothing around, and for some reason you have, say you have lead impacted soils or something, and that's why you're in the brownfields program. But there are going to be very few chances to not put vapor mitigation into townhomes. If you're in an urban environment, we're anticipating that we would need the vapor mitigation in the townhomes in an urban environment. So the second question was if there are rental units with ownership and everything, no individual ownership. Yes, that is a different scenario. So the question relates to if it looks like a townhome but kind of acts like an apartment, right? So there's the prospective developer is the owner of the property, and they will continue to be the owner. From an enforcement perspective, that gives us a little bit more assurance because we can deal with one person rather than trying to talk to individual property owners. So we do have an example of there is an example brownfields agreement where we did, there is rental townhomes. There are rental townhomes. That would have been it was a workforce housing project, and they had HUD requirements, and they had a requirement by HUD to own the property for 30 years. So we included that in the brownfields agreement that said the property may not be sold to individual property owners without prior DEQ approval. So I anticipate there would be something to that extent. There would be a land use restriction to that extent to ensure that it wouldn't get sold right away. So,
and that's an important thing because we recognize that there are things like that might get converted into townhomes. So we want to make sure that does not take place. If there remain rentals, that's okay. But if those are started up as rentals and then, 8-10 years down the road, those are converted into townhomes, that yet may be a problem. So that is something that we want to make sure that we have taken care of.
There was another question. Sorry, there's construction in my office, of course. So I'm sorry. There was another question. What project am I talking about? That project was Sackville Mill. It's been recorded. It was in Shelby. Are there any other questions about townhomes you all want to type in or raise your hand or? Okay, well, great. I will turn it over to Tracy and mute my construction noise.
I was going to ask earlier, I heard some pounding and I thought somebody was already pounding sand. Good morning, everyone. I hope this finds everyone doing well as we're muddling through this COVID-19 thing, but I hope everyone is doing well through it all. And as Bruce mentioned, I'm going to talk about methane. I think some of you know you've been dealing with the sites that have methane on them. And really, methane is everywhere. And we're just looking at this from a brownfields perspective. Can we work with methane on our sites? Can we safely redevelop them? So there's different forms of methane. There's the biogenic form of methane, which comes from the natural decomposition of organic matter. It's really quite prevalent in the Earth's surface. It's biogenic from natural decomposition, but there's also natural gas deposits. And it seems from our research that California really deals more with that a source of methane than we would deal with out here in North Carolina. But when we're looking at, natural decomposition sources of organic matter, what are we looking at? You might think of a landfill, of course, and pre-regulatory landfill or a dump site where some folks just dump some material over the years. But what we're finding actually is just from site clearing, just from grubbing a site and maybe burying some of those stumps and those root balls from trees, some brush material, and it gets buried on the site. And then we go in and say, okay, well, there's some areas, folks do test pits or something where we found some organic material. Let's check for methane. And we are literally seeing stuff that's on the upper end of the explosion limit. So this is, we fully admit this is a learning experience for us as well. We are not experts in methane. We are looking into it a lot, more than I really expected in my career, honestly. But this is where we are now, and we have a number of folks come to us and say, well, we'll just treat it like VI, and it's not just like volatiles. Volatiles, you're looking at a chronic exposure pathway. You're looking at something that's going to happen over a long period of time. Whereas with methane, it's acute. It can explode, and it has happened. And when you're in the explosive limits, that we've got to deal with that. But beyond that, there's also asphyxiation. Methane actually displaces oxygen and can fill a space to the point where people can asphyxiate. So we're looking at multiple issues associated with methane, and we do understand that the conditions have to be right for some of these catastrophic events to happen, but they have happened. And the next slide is an example of some that have been pulled together that have happened in the United States. Dating back to 1969, 2 of these on this list are from North Carolina. The one is the Armory in Winston-Salem. That is on a former landfill there. I don't think they realized perhaps that they were on top of waste. That happened in 1969. We happen to have a site nearby there, and PRLF recently in 2016, last 4 years, went out and did some sampling there, and we still have methane at over 50% by volume. So that is, just really, really high concentrations that have been in place for well over 50 years. And it still has a significant amount of methane associated with it. And then the other one was the park in Charlotte, of course. And I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with that, but that was, I believe, from a storm drain where a cigarette got tossed or something to that effect. But so these things do happen, they do occur. And when we're putting more and more people on these properties or near these properties, we have to be very cognizant of the impacts and effects that can have. And we have to make sure that we're implementing safe measures. So if we'll go to the next one, Jocelyn. So the why now has kind of been answered. We did have a few sites with methane on them over the years. They have been primarily recreational. I think we may have a warehouse and maybe a couple of more production-like facilities on some locations that had elevated methane. It wasn't a former landfill. It wasn't necessarily near a former landfill. Some of them have been landfills that we have done baseball fields or soccer fields. That's what we have done in the past. But I will say in the last probably 9 to 12 months, we have received more sites than ever in the program that want to redevelop, that have methane impact. And they seem to be leading towards a residential or something where there's going to be a high level of occupancy on the property. So this is why we are looking at methane now. in a much more focused context. And we really did go through this whole process where we just said, let's just say no. Let's just not do it. Let's just, we don't want to have people on these sites. And that's really not what this program is about. This program is about redevelopment. It's about doing so while protecting public health and the environment. So, we quickly went down the road of, we need to learn about this. We need to educate ourselves. We need to do a lot of research. And ironically, we haven't found, on the books anyway, a lot of either rules or guidance or regulation regarding methane. What we have found is that California seems to be the leader in regards to methane. And again, their sources tend to be primarily from the natural gas fields. And they essentially have their cities or counties are the ones developing the guidance, or it's going through, for instance, the city of LA has their Department of Building and Safety, and that's where you have to go and get your permits in order to build. And they have an entire methane section regarding that. So we have been tapping that type of information and collecting a lot of research for ourselves. We've also reached out to those that are experts in the field, those who have a proven track record, who have been doing methane mitigation and methane redevelopment across the United States and some of them internationally, and have talked to those folks and have gotten a lot of really good guidance from them on how to go about the safe reuse of a property. You can go to the next one, Jocelyn. So based on our research and the many, many rabbit holes that we have gone down, we have come up with many technical considerations, but really two things that we found are really important. And a lot of this we were not seeing in the initial evaluations that we were getting on properties. But what we're looking for are soil vapor concentrations, and we're looking for those landfill gases. What gases are there and in what concentrations? They give us an idea of where the decomposition is in its phases. Early on, it would be nitrogen and oxygen, just like we have atmospherically, but then it goes to, ending up being methane and CO2 is what we end up with as our final decomposition gases. And most of you probably know the explosive limits. The lower explosive limit is 5% by volume, which is 50,000 parts per million. And the upper explosive limit is 15% by volume, or 150,000 parts per million. But we're actually seeing sites with 20%, 50%, 72%. Now, typically, the decomposition gases are split approximately 50-50 with methane and CO2. But there are particular circumstances that would allow for CO2 to be absorbed into groundwater or dissolve into groundwater more readily and leave the methane behind, and we can have a higher composition of methane. So we're looking at all those items. But what we've also found, and I will admit that we did not realize this was a key to the evaluation of methane, was the static pressure of the subsurface vapor. That really controls the migration. That's a process by which advection is moving through pressure gradients, actually moving the methane through the subsurface, and can actually, under pressure, move it into buildings or structures or pipes or any pore space that's available. And then there's diffusion, which is when you don't have the pressure. And typically, I would say that's probably when your decomposition is pretty much over, but you just have the residual methane that's there diffusing through the subsurface. And doesn't have quite the ability to enter structures and pipes. And we found it's very important on how you measure the pressure and how these points are installed for soil gas measurement and making sure they don't leak, similar to VI soil gas measurements, and that we need to take that pressure first thing. When you go to do your sampling, collect that pressure, because if you purge it, you've gotten rid of all the pressure, and now we've got to come back another day and see if it reestablishes and what it looks like. But collect pressure first, and then have the instrument read what the gases are and the concentrations in that particular point. We can move on to the next one. So as we're going through this process, and I will say we are still in process here in developing guidance and restrictions for these methane impacted properties. We're coming up with assessment requirements. Those will definitely be forthcoming sooner than all our threshold guidance. And we are actually issuing some additional assessment letters related to this, and it has many of our requirements in those letters. So this will be coming out fairly soon. But definitely the landfill gases and the pressure monitoring over time, we need that information in order to make determinations on the site on how we can proceed. And if you have any inkling on your site when you come into the program that there could be buried debris, it could be C&D material. I had a site where it was just, you know, back in the 40s and 50s, they buried some structures that weren't very substantial, but we still had methane at levels at 5% of the LEL. So just make sure that as you go through your site, that you coordinate with your PM from the very beginning. And I think most of our PMs, if not all, are having project kickoff meetings. I know right now we're holding those remotely, but it still facilitates the necessary items that need to be looked at from a data gap assessment, or if it's initially just, you know, you need to do methane sampling on your site. And as I said, we're developing thresholds for approved uses, and we'll be using that static pressure and concentration levels to make these decisions. And I was almost thinking, I think we've said this is like a funnel system. It's almost like a dream catcher, where you have a big open circle on the outside and things can slip through. And we're looking at that as like recreational use. That would be our default. That would be the one that would be easiest to get through our process and to get a brownfields agreement on. We're not saying that you may not have to do some type of mitigation or, you know, what those safe making measures would be, but that would be the simplest one going forward. The next would be industrial. And we're, you know, no development on top of waste, and we're developing those thresholds for passive and active systems. And what those look like from concentrations, from pressures, from whether it's passive or, you know, maybe you have to do both. You have to do an active system and a barrier or something. But that's all stuff we are currently reviewing and would like to discuss a little bit more with some of the folks that are experts in the field. And then we're looking at level 3 being commercial uses. So our net and our intertwined space of our dream catcher is getting tighter and tighter of things that can go through here. And again, it's no development on top of waste, and figuring out what those mitigation measures need to be. And then the last one would be high density residential, where, you know, the townhome minimum requirements guidance already says that you can't develop on a dump site or a landfill. And we're just saying we're not doing townhomes on methane sites. Again, no development on top of waste. And then what are the actual required passive or active system? And this is, again, like all of our projects, is going to be site specific. It's going to be based on your project layout, the specific pressures and concentrations that you have at your site. This isn't a one size fits all approach. This is definitely look at each site individually, as we always have and always will, and figure out what what will be safe for that use and how we can go about satisfying DEQ to make sure it's safe for public health and the environment. Definitely a big issue on these methane sites. Is there another one? Okay, thought so. We are also developing some new LURs related to this that will be in brownfields agreements likely. We have one already that actually does dictate that there's an expert that needs to be on board and that a professional qualifications package needs to be approved by DEQ. And really what we're looking for here is for folks that have relevant experience, that you can show us an entire project list and these examples that you have worked on something very similar to what you are proposing to do a brownfields agreement on here in North Carolina. And it really needs to be apples to apples. So just keep that in mind. We do have precedent on that. We have used that in the past. And I think that is something that's definitely going to be implemented again. And then another LUR with pretty comprehensive requirements for the evaluation, mitigation, construction inspection, performance assurance, and monitoring that will be signed off by that PE or that professional firm that has been approved by DEQ, so that there is accountability through the entire process, and that falls on that group of folks with, DEQ having oversight of that. I think that is pretty much, yes, all I had. I don't know if Bruce, you wanted to jump in on any of that.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And Jocelyn, can we go back 2 slides, please?
Yep. Maybe. Yes.
Just a note on this particular slide here. I like Tracy's concept of a funnel or a dream catcher. The concept here is the different levels that you go to, the higher the type of possible use on here, the more risk or exposure those uses bring to the table would be require different levels of thresholds to allow you to that level. So, and I will also make the point here that we have just monikers on here, level 1, level 2, level 3, and then level 4, there's a typo there. That's my fault. That should say level 4 for high density residential. So as you're going up in those kinds of things, there would be some kind of process where we would look to static pressure and concentration mainly, and trying to figure out those kinds of things, allowing sort of threshold to allow you in. And then even after you're in those processes, on the next slide, Jocelyn, that talk about the different LURs that might help us out with those development processes in those individual cases where you have achieved whatever level you can on your site that has methane. And also, with regard to that, as to, some of this also depends on what is the definition of waste, where we are saying on these things, we believe from actual looking at the incidents that have taken place. One of the things they have in common is that, although they may not have known it at the time, it appears as though those developments took place over waste. So that being a really key component of what we're talking about here, when we have those incidents that have occurred, we want to make sure that we're not developing over waste. Now, the definition of waste can vary, and we're aware of what that might be, and we're talking about that right now. Obviously, when we're talking about something which is a covered over area that may have been a stump dump, that is somewhat different than we have an actual area that has methane generating waste disposal, whether it's municipal waste or other waste that generates methane. Obviously, those are 2 different things, but we're looking into the idea of what do we see in those concepts and sites that is different that'll allow us to have different approaches on those or not. And we haven't gotten to that point as of yet, but because we certainly have seen high methane levels in certain instances on sites that have primarily buried organic stumps and those kinds of things. Whether those are more hotspot related as opposed to related to a large area of waste, and how those change in concentration and pressure are all factors in where we would end up with that. So just wanted to add a few points on those slides as well. Okay, Jocelyn, next slide. A couple of questions that we received in advance. I think we've asked and answered a little bit more about the staffing update and where we stand with that. We have essentially, even in this period of COVID-19 situation, have added one staff person, are looking to add more as we are able to do so under the economics of what our model is for obtaining fees with which we can use to hire folks. And we are looking at that on a monthly basis to try to figure out where we stand with that. The methane issues, I think, on sites is something that is another question we received in advance, and obviously we've gone over that fairly good level of detail as to where we stand. We also received a question about what is the program's experience with PFAS, and I will just answer that question by saying we don't have a whole lot in that. I think we've had one site where a bank actually asked for PFAS sampling on a site. We haven't had any sites that we felt like we needed to ask for PFAS sampling. I feel sure that if somebody was going to want to redevelop a fire training site, that we would probably go into that realm. So we would be looking at this on a case-by-case basis where we felt like PFAS might be an issue, but I can tell you that it's not something that we have seen either routinely or at all, at least to this point. And then go right ahead, Jocelyn.
We had a methane question pop up in the comments, so I'll read it and let you guys respond. Essentially, where does the methane concern begin? For example, is there a lower threshold, like a 5%? Where would that begin? If not, what are the levels and pressures that require action, or is that in development? Any recommendations on how a PD can plan going forward would be helpful.
Okay. Well, I think what Tracy said initially in her methane discussion is that we are aware that methane exists in nature, and so we are aware that there can be significant levels of methane on the site that don't necessarily pose a problem. From what we have seen, there's a real lack of guidelines or anything at the state level other than in California for methane. And their situation is a little bit different in that they're dealing with natural gas fields which they can't help but build over. So, especially in Southern California. Right now, in those guidelines, what we are seeing is a 1.25% methane, which is basically 25% of the LEL. And those kinds of numbers are consistent with some of the guidelines and rules about building in structures in landfills, in municipal landfills. Also, you would see those kind of limits being used for that kind of thing. So I think, when we're talking about what kind of sites can start, what kind of levels start concerning us, we're talking about levels in that range. Somewhere in the range of 10 to 25% of the LEL, which would be the LEL being 50,000 parts per million. So in the range of 10 to 25% of that is something that we would be looking at trying to figure out what is the history of this site. Do we have a site that has been grubbed and there are buried stumps? Do we have a situation where we have a former quarry that people dumped things in, and then has been since covered up, or an otherwise pre-regulatory landfill, which we have seen plenty of. So the site history levels, and then, we don't know pressures obviously necessarily at the beginning, but understanding what those pressures are going forward is very important to understanding, do we have a potential risk on these sites. So it's hard for me to say exactly what concerns us, but I would say that in that 10 to 25% range of methane is where we're likely to end up. Are there any other questions, Jocelyn, that have come up? I hope I've answered that one.
Nothing in the chat box so far. Give yourself extra time if you have methane on your site. Oh.
All right, well, very good. And so I will, at this point in time, we should probably go ahead and open it up into an open forum for folks to ask questions, and we will try to get those answers to you, either via your questions in the chat box that Jocelyn is monitoring, or Jocelyn, if we want to unmute people or have them raise their hand so we can unmute them and ask their question.
They have to unmute themselves. I can't unmute anybody.
Right.
But yeah, if you have a question, please. Yeah, it would be help if you can raise your hand if you have that feature available. Bruce, while we're waiting for some questions, did you want to speak to that last bullet on the Q&A, residential and townhome evaluations for suitability? Did I miss? Maybe I missed that.
Oh yeah, that was one other question that we received in advance. And are there issues or things that we can tell people at the beginning of this process that would let them know that there are issues pertaining to residential and or townhome evaluations that are no-goes? And I think that's sort of where we're headed with at least for a methane question for that, with our sort of thresholds into the levels of different higher levels of development and higher end uses. So we are developing those thresholds, and we are looking at those right now. I don't have specific data as to where those are going to end up, but it's going to be a combination of concentration and pressure. I will just say that, pressures, the kinds of levels of pressures that we're talking about that can be significant, range from as low as a half an inch of water up to maybe like 3 inches of water in terms of that kind of level of pressures that we're talking about in the subsurface that would give us pause. And those are the kinds of things that we're looking at in sort of a matrix format along with pressures.
Tracy had something to add.
Along with concentrations.
Mine is separate, and I see Chris Walker has a methane related question. So let's do that first.
Putting methane and townhomes aside, what types of conditions would not allow multifamily residential?
Well, in terms of that, I think if we have situations where we have we don't have a handle on what is taking place in the subsurface, and we have significant contamination on a site that might be up gradient. And the thing that I can think of right now is a site where we had a DISCA site up gradient that had really very, very high TCE, PCE levels, and the brownfield site happened to be down gradient of it. And although the numbers on the brownfield site were not as high, the migration of the directly up gradient site was uncontrolled. It was not in DISCA, and we just didn't know exactly what was going to be taking place on that site. And so with those extremely high numbers and the possibility of that kind of migration, we felt like residential was not suitable at that time for that site. It could be a situation where we're trying to design for something we did not know existed, and it would be too difficult to make sure that we were getting that accomplished. Now, when that site ultimately gets control and DISCA is able to put that plume in a situation where they have it under control, maybe things would change on that site. But that was one that I recall in advance that we would say, we don't feel like residential would be suitable. And so, I mean, the only thing I can answer your question with, Chris, is a lot of what we do is on a site-specific decision-making level. It's a difficult thing for us to put numbers out, and we sort of like are here to encourage safe redevelopment, and so we don't like necessarily putting things out with numbers and saying you can't do this on this number. And so, you know, recognizing that those kinds of situations are dynamic. In that case, an example I'm giving you, it was felt like we would be wise not to have residential redevelopment on that particular site. And in a sense, that site was really almost the chemical equivalent of what we're talking about here in methane, particularly because it involved TCE, and TCE has a lot of risk associated with it, which is immediate as opposed to chronic. So a lot of factors go into those kinds of decisions, and it's difficult to write some kind of one-size-fits-all guidelines. If you have this, you can't do that. You're welcome, Chris. I saw your reply. Thank you.
Tracy, did you want to add?
Yeah, my comment was more about the staffing, and just as, you know, attorneys, consultants, PDs out there, if you know you're going to have projects coming, please just let us know. I think Bruce mentioned that we had you know, lower applications in May. June seems to have picked up so far early on, but that will help us make our argument to get more resources. You know, when the folks above us in finance sees that our applications drop off, they want to wait and see what's going to happen. But if we can give them some idea, and we have some idea of advance notice that, hey, this project, you know, we're going to have 6 more projects coming here by the end of the month. That will help us both for planning purposes for our existing staff, because our queue is still really high, but also give us the justification to move forward with additional resources. So if you know of sites, just, you know, if you want to reach out to me for West, or Sharon in the East, or directly to Bruce, please do so, or even, you know, individual PMs, just so we have some idea of what's coming and for our own planning. That was it.
And I will say also that the person that we have hired, Holly Samaha, is going to be a project manager, and that is, you know, where we're going to be having some hires to try to make sure that we can have fewer projects per staff person. And in addition to that, one of the things that this particular hire is liable to do for the program is one of the perceived bottlenecks that we see has been ability to get to timely reviews on vapor intrusion plans and vapor intrusion mitigation systems. And so with this hire, we're going to be able to shift some of our expertise to do just that. So we're going to hopefully be able to reduce the amount of time that our vapor intrusion reviews are going to be taking. And that's just with this one hire, it's going to allow us to do that. And I think we're going to see seeing a significant VI timeline improvement.
No other questions? Really?
Come on, you guys, you're going to make us choose this venue in the future.
Yeah. I'll give a little, the beneficial fill, Bruce mentioned update to the beneficial fill rule. That is, he mentioned the same schedule that we talked about in March, but a reminder that hopefully will be in public comment around late summer, August-ish. So keep your eye out for that beneficial fill rule modification. So, but that wouldn't likely be implemented until early next year at the earliest. So. Anything else? I mean, you don't even have to talk. You can type it in the comment and I'll say it.
That's okay. If we're not getting any questions.
Nope.
I guess the other thing that I'll just mention is, we're not exactly sure what may take place in the future in terms of timeline for us to get back into office or into meeting modes. But if this forum is helpful to you, even in this context of having it on Microsoft Teams, we'd like to know. Because if it comes down to it, we want to continue to make the commitment to have these kinds of things on a quarterly basis. So, looking at that about 3 months from now, if this kind of forum, even in this context of not meeting, is useful, we'd like to continue to have this kind of a thing on Microsoft Teams if necessary. And so, us knowing whether this is beneficial to you or you're not, don't think this is worth it, we would like to know those comments.
We did get a question in. Can we, other than the brownfield agreement shell that we're working on, can we speak to other things that are being done to speed up the agreement process?
Well, I mean, I think the main thing on speeding up the agreement process is being able to have folks have lower numbers of projects on their plates. Right now, the numbers of projects on an individual project manager plate number around 20. And so we really, need to get that number probably cut significantly, almost in half. And then we are able to probably move things forward on a much quicker pace. That's really what we're seeing. I think some of the things that we have done thus far have helped. Some of the processes that we have generated out of trying some of the things in the pilot, such as moving forward with kickoff meetings and having those kinds of pre-meetings where a environmental consultant has been able to provide their input right up front as to the data gaps that still exist on the property, even after reviewing all of the information that's there, has helped. And we'll continue to look for those kinds of things. Right now, with this process, we had, before COVID-19, approval through the secretary's level to hire 8 individual staff. That was ultimately cut to 5 and then to 2. So we're looking to next year for the opportunities to be able to do that and be able to reduce the number of projects on an individual staff person's plate.
Bruce, I'd also add to that we are also taking the opportunity to train some of our more junior staff on putting together data tables and risk calculators and being a support to the brownfield project managers to help move things along faster. So that's something else that we've instituted quite a while ago, actually. So.
Yeah. And I would also say that just looking at the numbers that we have seen since we have, the COVID-19 going out, the numbers that have been, we have been turning around documents and processes. I'm looking at the numbers of projects, and I have a little switch and all the projects that we have ongoing. I have actually on a whiteboard right here, and that there is a whole lot of projects in this status list where the ball is in the court of the PD as opposed to ball is in our court, and those kinds of numbers look extremely good, especially when you look at them in comparison to what happened prior to COVID. And I just would say that in the context of COVID, Microsoft Teams has given us a great deal of almost instant collaboration that didn't exist in the program prior. Now, I'm not saying, I mean, we have learned Microsoft Teams as out of necessity, but I think in the context of what's going on, in the context of teleworking, but having instant communication and a lot of feedback and a lot of internal communication that's ongoing and training, and have you seen this before? Here's some language we can all use and share. There's a lot of internal communication like that that's ongoing that it has been facilitated literally. And so I think those kinds of processes that we're seeing right now is reflected in the numbers and the turnaround times on documents, work plans, and other things that are coming through the program right now. So we a lot of what we are seeing on the whiteboard that we have projects on moving is more turnover and getting balls into prospective developers' courts than ever before. And so that is encouraging to me, because when we started this process of teleworking, it was one of those things where I wasn't sure exactly what might happen along those lines. But I have to say that the staff has been amazing. They have been using Microsoft Teams and other things to do a lot more communication. And I think that there's a benefit that's ongoing right now.
I want to add that property management is utilizing other DEQ staff that may not have, for whatever reason, their workload may have decreased because of the stay-at-home orders and things like that. So you'll see a couple of different names if you've submitted recent property management unit requests. There may be some names you're not familiar with, but so we are actively utilizing some of those folks at DEQ. So hopefully that will help on our end.
Yeah, and I don't mind specifically saying that some of those and the coordination we've been doing along those lines with the DISCA staff, largely because DISCA has been having issues associated with their whole industry being shut down, really, tax revenue and other things associated with that. So it's something that we're able to immediately take those kinds of staff and put them on certain kinds of tasks and projects in our program, and it has been super helpful, and we are very appreciative of the dry cleaning program for that. It's been very helpful.
Importantly, we have a question of how's Shirley? So Shirley, they're asking about you.
Shirley is doing great. Thank you, Rob, for that question. But no, Shirley is doing fine, and she is one of our essential staff people who is actually taking some time and being in the office. Obviously, there are rules for those folks who are in the office, but she's not there full time either. She has plenty of opportunity to be able to work from home, telework at home, and do a lot of our document management and other things online. So Shirley is certainly able to function without being in the office full time either. So that's good.
You're muted, Jocelyn. There you go.
Are there any other questions?
Slowly. If not, are you ready to wrap it up?
Yes, with no more questions, we will wrap it up. Thank you all for attending this. Let us know via your questions, comments, and emails how this session worked for you or did not work for you. And we will, if this has been useful to you, let us know, and we will try it again in the next quarter, sometime in September.
Yep. If you did not receive the email, so the email list is just growing based on who attends. So if you were forwarded the email and didn't receive it directly, feel free to email me or BF Property Management. That's our property management unit general email address. And we will get you included on emails for the future. It's not intended to exclude anybody. We want anybody to be able to join and get notifications. It's just an element of it growing as we have more meetings. So shoot us an email, we'll get you on the list.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week.
Goodbye, everybody.